Hey class, welcome to the first lecture. I just want to go through a little bit of an intro and take you through what we're going to be studying or looking at in Module 1. So Module 1 is really easy. There's only one thing we really want to think about, and that is capitalism and what is capitalism. So let me just run through this really quick. First of all, before we get started, since the whole theme of this class is a history of business, technology, and society and 14 innovations, I think it's important that we know what an innovation is. And I think everyone knows what an innovation is, but just in case you don't, an innovation in my mind is a new method, idea, or product. And I think sometimes we think of an innovation just in the product sense, but it can be an idea or a method as well. So with that in mind, our first new innovation is free market capitalism. And from my opening lecture, I talked about business in the U.S. and how it's a big deal and sort of the history of how it came all about. And there's an article you're going to read in Module 1, a really short article, it's like a one-pager, that talks about capitalism came on the first ships. So check that out. The meaning just builds off of my intro lecture that capitalism has been around since day one, if you consider the British colonization of North America, which eventually becomes the United States. So we're kind of crazy for capitalism in this country, and you need to know what capitalism is if you're going to study business. So Calvin Coolidge had this famous quote, back in the day, that the business of America is business. And I think that summarizes where we're coming from as a culture, that we're really a business crazy culture. I mean, the stock market is reported every day, and it's important to people because we invest our retirement, for example, into the stock market, into capitalist corporations. So it's an important concept to understand when we're talking about American business. Now, one of the best ways to understand something is to look at the opposite. So capitalism, the big deal there, the definition is that capitalism represents an economic system that's controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. So if you want to contrast capitalism to anything, probably the most useful economic theory or system is either pure socialism or communism. And you can see here under communism, all property is publicly owned. So you can see property from private owners, property by public owners, or really the government in the case of communist countries, which there really aren't any pure communist countries. That's the big difference. Free market capitalism represents this idea that you can own property, you can own a factory, you can own intellectual property, and we'll learn about that in the next module when we talk about patents. So again, capitalism, sort of the opposites are really communism or pure socialism, where things are owned by the community as a whole, or in most cases the government. So this is the key word right here, private ownership. So just keep that in mind as you go through. As far as where this idea of capitalism came from, this economic structure, this guy right here is Adam Smith, and he wrote a book back in 1776 called The Wealth of Nations, and it was really this capitalist manifesto that the free market will take care of itself and that people should be able to profit and be able to sell their products. And he came up with this whole idea of laws of supply and demand. So if you're a business major especially, you should certainly know who Adam Smith is. And then on the opposite side of Smith is Karl Marx. And you've heard of Marxism before. He wrote a book called Das Kapital in 1867. And Marx's theory that capitalism by nature is greedy because it's for profit. So capitalism in Marx's mind always exploited the working class, and Marx felt that eventually there was going to be a revolution and the workers were going to take over. And in the early 1900s, during the first union movement, for example, business owners were describing unions as socialist or communist because it was this idea that workers were getting too much power, and they feared sort of a Marxist revolution would happen if the workers got too much power through unions. So that's why unions, especially early on, were really controversial. So again, Smith thought that markets would take care of everything. So if you had a skill or goods that others wanted to buy, everything would work out in the long run. It was up to you to make as much money as you wanted. And Marx, as I just said, saw this idea of exploited people and felt like capitalism wasn't sustainable. It couldn't last. And these are really complicated philosophies, and you can get in some really good arguments over these philosophies. All I'm talking about right now is an economic framework, and it's not something we need to get in depth in this class. So, why is the U.S. so touchy when it comes to socialism, capitalism? I think one of the reasons is because from the founding of the country, liberty and freedom was always a big deal. And free market capitalism implies that you can buy property, you can invent something, you can buy a factory, and you can do your own thing with little or no government intervention. So that's one reason that capitalism is a big deal here and that people are touchy about it. Also, there's this legacy of rejecting tyranny. So the whole reason that the Declaration of Independence was popular back in 1776 was because it represented this freedom away from King George and from the tyrannical rule of England. So again, this idea of freedom, free market, and capitalism all kind of run together. Later, after World War II, during the Cold War, the USSR was a communist country. They were a Marxist country. And so since we were in the Cold War with the USSR, there was this big battle of, the capitalists versus the communists. So that's another reason we're touchy about it in this country. And that's the political debates today, that, the conservatives want less government intervention into business. People were accusing Obama of being a socialist. They accuse programs like Obamacare, as socialist programs because it's forcing people to do something, and many conservatives see it as the government trying to control what corporations have to do with healthcare. That's just one small example, but some conservatives complain about every little bit of government regulation, whether it's clean air legislation or whether it's Social Security, where you're forced to give your money to the government for investing reasons. So just keep that in mind as we go through. And again, this class isn't about capitalism at all, but in order to understand business in the United States, you have to have this foundation of knowing what capitalism is. So, again, these things I covered, why we're sensitive about capitalism versus socialism. But at the same time, what I want to make sure you're aware of is that there's really, no pure form of capitalism or socialism. So some people call Western European countries more socialist because of national health care and because of more regulation in business. But that having been said, we have really socialist enterprises, here in the U.S. Public schools, for example. That's something that you're forced to pay for through taxes. Highways, defense, even the University of Toledo, being a state university, in some sense is funded by the government or funded by the people, and you have little say in where your tax dollars are spent. Another socialist type enterprise would be the water supply or the sewage system. Those are run by the government, and there was a time in the progressive era in the early 1900s when there was a big movement that all utilities, electric company, phone company, should all be run by the government. But again, it was this argument that that's too socialist, that's too much government control of business, and it goes against our capitalist ethos in this country. So for this module, there's a couple of things you need to do. You need to introduce yourself on the discussion board. Keep in mind this is a public forum, so obviously don't say anything else. Don't say anything that you don't want anyone else to know. Read that article that came in the first ships. It kind of tells you about the origins of capitalism in the U.S. There's another article defining capitalism, communism, socialism. Pay attention to the highlighted sections. Again, that's a brief article. And then complete the discussion board assignment that I've called Greedy by Nature. And the idea there is if we're all operating under capitalist principles, in other words, if I own a business and I'm paying my workers as little as possible so I can make more profit for myself, that's sort of an example of capitalism. And what I want to know in this discussion board is whether or not you think capitalism is greedy by nature, or if you think there's such a thing as moral capitalism. You've probably, or some of you have probably worked for companies that pay you very little and don't treat you very well in the interest of making more profit for themselves. But some of you have also worked for businesses that pay you a very fair wage, that provide very good health benefits and very good insurance, and it's a kinder, gentler capitalism, if you will. So I want you to think about that. I don't have to, I'm not going to put any specification as to how many words you have to write or anything like that, but give me a paragraph of what you think about capitalism and if you feel at its core it's greedy by nature or not. So that's it for this week. Enjoy your week. Next week we're going to get into our second innovation, which is patents and trademarks. It's another basis definition, a baseline definition that we need to know before we get into the rest of the semester. Thanks and have a great week.